Good morning, all of you. And this is a short video on how to deal with the subject called linguistics. Linguistics is basically a study of language based on science or scientific methodology. Generally, people perceive that as a difficult thing, but it is not. Actually, it is a very vibrant subject. It engages people differently, and whatever we have understood related to our culture, the kind of language that is being used in media, the kind of interactions that people do, conversations that people do, whatever we read, whatever we write, they are all in a way related to this broad area called linguistics. It is not uh, the way a popular perception that is there regarding language studies. Now, we need to know that it is actually a valid analysis of language structure. It talks about a valid language analysis. And there are different ways of approaching it. There are, say, some people say that a new language is better than a primitive language, a correct language and an incorrect language, maybe a written language and a spoken language. Well, linguistics, that subject doesn't go for such distinction like new and old. Any data that is related to language that was or is used by human beings, that is a very important document for analysis. It's a valid document. And there is nothing like an archaic language and a new language. And whenever people make mistakes, people say that it is an incorrect language. But for a linguist, it is an evidence of something that an inquiry has to be made. Similarly, they don't distinguish between much about what we call as the written and the spoken language, even though both are valid, and they say that they should be analyzed independently. So the idea of or the notion of rules is significant for linguists, but more than that, they try to identify the soul of the language and how can be approached scientifically. So they say there are possibilities of analyzing language as such. We call it synchronic, or they say it is also possible to analyze a language as part of history. They say it is diachronic. We will look into the terms later in detail. So whenever we look into the levels of linguistics, please understand it is not difficult. We need to understand them as a kind of a movement from the bottom level idea of all possible human sounds, and then we can call it as phonetics. But when we classify them in terms of understanding each sounds, we call it as phonology. When we move on to the idea of or the level of words, bringing all these sounds together in terms of units, we call it morphology. When all these words later on, when these words bring together or come together to create a sentence, we call it the idea of syntax or the analysis of the sentences, the patterns of sentences. And then once we move further, when we think in terms of meaning, we can consider what we call as the semantic aspect of language. And finally, as I do now, when we actually use the language for a particular purpose or a certain purpose, we call it pragmatics. So, what I would suggest is linguistics tries to understand language in terms of all these levels. So basically, linguistics is a matter of analyzing language in terms of science. So don't pretend otherwise. We should not believe that linguistics is difficult. It is, of course, when we move to the abstract levels, we need to spend more time on the analysis of language. But generally, one should not look at that in an apprehensive mode. We need to understand how it functions at various levels. So at each and every level, there are necessities on the part of various researchers, scholars to go and do further inquiry and find out how far it can be useful for students, especially for those who are learning a language. For example, English language, they need to know that linguistics has something to do with the analysis of the language. So when we try to learn a language, we need to know how the grammar has been there, or how it has been evolved. So we should not be bothered about the rules of grammar as we generally say. Grammar is of course important for the case of a universal kind of a standardization, but more than that, we need to apply ourselves at various levels to understand a language. For that purpose, I should say linguistics is a wonderful area, and it can give us an insight into how language functions, how it is being used by people, how they prepare a discourse, a series of ideas flow into a kind of structure by which people can understand. So whether it is a politician, whether it be a lawyer or a judge, whether it be a scientist, a teacher, or even a doctor. Now, all these are important for us to understand how language is functioning at various levels. So when a priest declares in front of an audience in a church that uh, from henceforth you are man and wife, it is also a kind of a function, a linguistic function. We will look into these details later as we move on to the actual subsections. So thank you for watching this short video on what we need to understand about linguistics. Thank you.